Today I'm gonna go into Dissolution Liberalism, but I realized aside from watching Malcolm X, we didn't hear much specifically from Black nationalists. Did I play Stokely Carmichael for you guys? So we didn't hear Stokely Carmichael. So we'll start off by listening to Carmichael and Farrakhan, and then also the transition into Dissolution Liberalism. I'll talk a little bit about sort of closing out the Black Marxism piece, and then we'll finish up with sort of Dissolution Liberalism, and begin to set up. We'll start on Tuesday, which will be Black Conservatism. Thursday, I have an all-day long conference. I'm going to be at UCLA, but it starts at 8:30 to 6, so we are, as a result. And they're flying all kinds of people in, so I couldn't adjust the schedule to meet the class schedule. So we see there Stokely Carmichael laying out some of the kind of basic tenets of Black Power in 1966, and marking kind of the frustration that was a part of his transition from being a mainstream civil rights activist to a person who espouses Black Power. And you can see his expression of sort of frustration with progress. We'll pick that up at another part in the lecture, and we'll use that to talk about sort of disillusioned liberalism, because there's a kind of space for those who don't make the transition all the way either to Marxism or nationalism when they become frustrated with American progress. There's a space for them to occupy. Here we'll actually hear Louis Farrakhan giving a speech at the National Press Club. So we saw sort of two versions in that of kind of Black nationalism, both expressing a kind of frustration with sort of white racism institutions. What's the role for whites in Stokely Carmichael's speech? Yeah. Right, they need to hear rules to say the blacks are equal. What, you're in the front?
Oh, sorry. Pretty much that they have the power to release us.
Well, that's Stokely Carmichael.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. That's actually the first one, right? 1966 in Berkeley. He said, white people cannot give us freedom, we're born free.
Right, but they could stop taking it away.
Well, yeah, they can enslave us and then free us there, but they don't have the power to free us.
I don't know if I'm repeating the same thing she is, but I was saying that they need to acknowledge that they don't have the power that they think that they have to enslave and take ownership of different parts of the world.
Right.
I was going to mention that institutional racism, but that the ones are in control of, they're in sheer control of institutions.
Right, and they need to fix it, right? That there's a white, that there isn't a race problem that's about Black people. There's a white problem, and whites need to fix it, right, themselves. And he even uses the line to, it's a problem in white communities, right? That's where racism resides. What are whites supposed to do for Louis Farrakhan? Is there much of an affirmative responsibility? What are whites supposed to do? What is he asking them to do?
To correct it while they can.
What's the correction? Yeah.
I would say they need to find a universal solution that considers the masses like everyone.
Right. But what does it seem to be? What is the consideration? What's that?
What to do with the 31 million Black people out here.
Right. And what is he suggesting?
Let them build their own nation.
Let them build their own nation, right? So whites need to give them maybe some resources, probably some kind of reparations, and just get out of the way, right? And he begins with talking about internal problems with black people, right? They're robbed of their history, so we need to rediscover our senses of ourselves. And he goes and he repeats, in some ways, right, Farrakhan kind of trumpets something that in particular white supremacists would be quite comfortable with, right? He basically recast the notion of the United States as a white nation, saying it was sort of never meant for black people to have citizenship in the context of the U.S. It was never intended, so why don't we do something else, right? All the attempts to sort of paper over that have just been sort of phony window dressing. So in many ways, these kinds of frustrations are a part of a general set of things. I wanted just to make sure that I ran through a number of different kinds of issues. And one of the kind of principal conflicts was also between Stokely Carmichael and Angela Davis, because Carmichael himself, while he kind of hung out with the Black Panthers, actually in the end rejected socialism as a kind of central solution, and in particular the way in which that whites might play a role as well, in particular class politics. So in many cases, and you saw with sort of Farrakhan's just trying to, we just need to build up. He's not critiquing capitalism. The problem is simply racism and racism in and of itself. And he's also challenging liberal or radical egalitarian leadership in the guise of Jesse Jackson. Now I'm going to give you a Angela Davis speech to hear kind of Black Marxist tract. You see there, what happens is Angela Davis draws a connection between racial oppression, class inequality, and the processes through which people land themselves in prison. This has a kind of long history, right? The first, at the advent of Jim Crow, when slavery was over in the South, a lot of prisons were built and constructed around things like, in particular, they had vagrancy laws. So if you were an unemployed black man, you could be imprisoned for not having a job. You were vagrant. So you weren't tied to a sharecropping thing. You weren't tied to the land somewhere. You could be jailed and imprisoned for being vagrant. And so therefore, and then prisons built themselves around, particularly prisons in places like Louisiana and other places, built themselves around prison labor. So then you were forced to work in the context of prison. So and you can see how this is a way to recreate a version of slavery. Like Angela Davis, who take this kind of approach, think about the sort of modern prison system. Yeah. Okay, so vagrancy was if you could not produce proof that you were either a sharecropper or under someone's employ, that you were unemployed, you were then vagrant. You were not under anyone's employ, and you could be arrested and jailed for being vagrant. Pardon me? What do you mean audited? No, it's that you're standing on the street, you're not doing anything, or you're not supposedly working. It was a decision of the individual police officers, judges, or whomever to decide whether they were vagrant or not, or whether they were going to investigate whether you were vagrant or not. This provided a sort of wide ability for them to arrest large numbers of black men at any point in time. We could reproduce this in terms of what's the sort of similar version of this that operates in terms of in Los Angeles currently. There's a version of the immigration crackdown, but more importantly, what's the other thing? Gang inductions, right? The idea that you can be arrested for supposedly being reputed to be a member of a gang. How does anyone know who is, who isn't a gang member? What does that mean? And a version of, ironically, the Jamil's Law, right? That's being attempted to be placed onto the books now, pushed by some African Americans, targeting quote unquote immigrant, undocumented or quote unquote illegal immigrant gang members, right? Is to provide police with sort of wide authority to stop and arrest Latino men, right? Young Latino men, because given how someone is walking down the street, how can I tell either their citizenship status, whether or not they're gang affiliated or not? The basic sort of argument is it provides a broad pretext to arrest Latino men. And in some cases, these kinds of laws are developed and applied. I can't remember, there's some place, I think up in sort of Ventura County somewhere, where they're trying to, in order to stop gang members, they're trying, oops, sorry about that.
Lately is the prison system.
They're trying to pass an ordinance that says that you can be unneutered Rottweilers or pit bulls are against the law. You can be ticketed for them, and so therefore, and the local sheriff even said, "Oh, we really don't care about the dogs. This is really a pretext for us to arrest immigrant Latino gang members because they have these kinds of dogs. So we want a law and an ordinance that gives us the ability to stop, frisk, and arrest these people." And so one of the arguments that's beginning to develop, right, is that the emergence of the prison system is a kind of form of class warfare by Black Marxists, right? That the prison system now and currently has been a way of, warehousing poor people and surplus labor. That's also been connected with the rise and development of various kinds of prison industries. Not only the idea of using people in prison for their labor, but also the use of and the large contracts in prison for companies that provide food, telephone, and other kinds of services for prisoners. So that is you take people out of their communities, and these companies are now increasingly private companies are making money by contracting to provide these services. Also, where generally also are prisons located? One has to think about the sort of California prison system or the federal prison system. Where do they often put or build prisons? Out in the middle of nowhere, which frequently are poor, overwhelmingly white rural communities, right? So the prison system provides jobs. So what you do is you take large numbers of, in particular, Black, brown men, women, you warehouse them in prisons in largely poor rural white communities with good union jobs, and you supplement the local economy of those communities where the sort of basis of the economy is largely built off the imprisonment of people from urban communities. And what are most of the people in prison for? Pardon me?
People incarcerated for drug offenses, non-violent offenses.
Right, so drug offenses, right? So you take largely nonviolent drug offenses and you arrest large numbers of people. You incarcerate them for increasingly large periods of time, and you even actually have sort of, depending upon what kind of drugs you have disparate sentences. For instance, in federal law, right, the punishment for crack cocaine is exponentially higher than the punishment for having powder cocaine. And who's generally found to have crack cocaine? Black and brown people. Who generally has powder cocaine? Wealthier middle class white people. Who as a percentage uses the most drugs in America? White people. Who gets arrested for drugs? Black people. So there's a sort of disparate use of kind of enforcement mechanisms that then produces it. So black Marxists have become really interested in this idea that essentially, right, on one hand, black labor, which increasingly began to unionize, challenges exploitation, has not become sort of pliable. So then to create that as surplus, but to then make money off of it, you put black people in prison. Then what's the flip side of that? Where do you then get your other part of your surplus labor from? Who works at the bottom of the labor market? Right, undocumented immigrants, right? And why do you want them to be undocumented? So that they can be exploited, right? So they have no rights, or very few rights that they can actually exercise to demand, worker safety, that they be paid the minimum wage, or overtime, or a range of different other things. And so in some ways the processes work together. And in fact, you found that things like food processing plants in places like Arkansas and other places were working with coyotes and people to bring people across the border to work in the plant. Almost, we're actually engaged in paying to have people trafficked to work in food processing plants and places like that, right? The idea is that you want a set of workers in the U.S. That can provide that cheap, pliable labor. And what's one of the solutions, right? That say, for instance, has been proposed for this is, we'll spend much more money on prisons, less on education, and the California prison system now costs more. We spend more on it than we do on the University of California. Present company excluded, but many prison guards make more than most in a year, given their overtime, than most professors at a place like UCLA. That's not me, but I can say that I do beat the prison guards out on that one, and I'm proud of it. But one of the things is the prison guards union then not only just sort of operates to deal with the kind of working conditions for prison guards, but has been working to advocate for longer and harsher prison sentences for an increasing number of crimes. Why? Because the longer and the more people in prison, the more prison guards you need, the more money they make. So it's a vicious cycle. And actually, to his credit, one of the things that Arnold Schwarzenegger actually did at one point was he's actually sort of, unlike many Republicans, he's actually gone after the prison guards union in California, saying, look, you guys are taking too much money here. This is not an efficient use of resources. And as you see, there's substantial prison overcrowding. Yeah.
But he also tried to export a lot of prisoners over to offices in other neighboring states that tie the prison system too, which is against the law.
Right. Yeah. Well, faced with, so then as governor, he's faced with the sort of, people get faced with this idea of, at some point when you start to have budget problems, right, and California's going to face this, you start to ask yourself, well, how much are we spending to imprison this number of people? And what are we willing to spend? What percentage, when we're cutting other kinds of basic public health and safety, education and other sorts of things, what are we willing to spend? And so then the cheap solution is let me see, in order to deal with the fact that the prison system, the health care was substandard, it was taken over by federal courts, there's substantial overcrowding, and he doesn't want to spend the money. he was sort of looking for a way, this is the other kind of capitalist solution. What do? You outsource it, right? So let's, outsource prisoners to private prisons operated in other states. And that is, and those places have been also known to have substantial, though probably substantial different kinds of abuses and a lack of kind of control. And so these are the kinds of things that have become central problems and kind of difficulties that are driven by both sort of poverty, which tends to lead people to make certain kinds of choices that lead to crime, but also the kind of the fact of being sort of black and brown and poor, and being exposed to, or much more likely to have the kind of intervention of police or face arrest for sort of petty drug offenses, et cetera, that then lead to long prison terms. And this creates some of the kinds of things that, in particular, Black Marxists are concerned about and are thinking about from the perspective of class and labor, and how it works to sort of how the society is dealing with, rather than constructing a welfare state and a social safety net that provides a sort of minimum income or possibility for certain kinds of subsistence for people who might not be employed or who might be in between employment. That the system, one of the ways that it does is it captures them, it begins to capture them fairly quickly into the sort of cycle of incarceration. So much so that sociologists have begun to think about prison as being part of the life cycle, one of the sort of part of the life cycle and maturation process of Black men. That sort of, 1 in 4 Black men has some connection with the sort of the criminal justice system or the prison system. So that you have to, as you sort of think about someone's maturation as they grow, like the things like you go to school, you get married, you have children, you make a thing. So now sociologists are beginning to think about what are the effects of prison being a part of Black men's particularly sort of life cycle as they move towards into their adult years, and thinking about what are the effects of that, both sort of community effects. We'd also think about the effects of being in prison in terms of the spread and contraction of HIV/AIDS, which is the fastest growing in Black communities. We can think about those kinds of things, right? Men enter prison, they come out, they have partners who are back out in the community, and AIDS frequently gets, or HIV frequently gets spread in those manner. So if we're sort of studying those kinds of things, we can understand the different effects. The effects of prison on their children, the effects on their families, the costs in terms of resources, et cetera, the kind of the sense of kind of absence, as well as the kind of socialization that goes on in the context of prisons. Prisons no longer rehabilitate people. They're there entirely as units of punishment, right? They no longer see their mission as a kind of to rehabilitate or to prepare someone to re-enter to society. You're there to be punished for what you're done. So when people are done with their time, they're not prepared to re-enter in terms of jobs, a range of other things, which begins a new set of cycles where people re-enter the system. But we could think about this, right? Black Marxists have become very interested in this as being a kind of product of a cycle of class inequality that's also connected to questions of race and racism, as well as the way in which work in the prison system and prison guards benefits poor white communities. And so again, you have the system of playing the poor Black working class off of the poor white working class, but giving the white working class a kind of additional benefit, right? The ability to operate the prison. What's the current biggest drug epidemic in the country right now? Crystal methamphetamine, right? And I couldn't sort of transport you guys back to the mid '80s, but you hear relatively little about crystal meth, right? You know, you don't turn on your nightly news, and you don't see stories about women neglecting their children, how people's teeth are rotting out of their heads. You don't see them, you know, sort of chasing around how, you know, people are selling sex and the level of violence being produced by the sort of, you know, crystal meth. If during the sort of height of the crack epidemic, there's no such thing as a crystal meth baby, right? Where they, you know, came up with the context of the crack baby. You know, there was supposedly some generation of people who were going to be, you know, inherently criminal as a result of their mother's addiction to crack. In fact, embarrassingly enough, well, not embarrassingly, a former student of mine who was, I guess, apparently his mom was crack addicted, and a couple of years ago, he graduated from law school. And I mean, just ironically, right, a newspaper where he graduated from law school did a news story, you know, crack baby graduates from law school. You know, and it actually turned out to be a bunch of bullocks, right? I mean, absolutely untrue. There was nothing, it turned out that there were no real sort of long-term effects on kids whose moms had been involved in crack, that was just a kind of, and in fact they were crafting sort of prison sentences for in particular sort of women who were involved in crack. But you see none of that, right? You know, the methamphetamine sort of problem is actually growing, is a huge epidemic. But it is largely in poor, rural, and white communities. And in fact, one of my actually graduate students did a kind of study comparing the coverage and about how the coverage of the meth epidemic tended to focus on how the people needed help and treatment. Whereas the coverage of the crack epidemic is that the people were violent, they're criminals, and they need prison. Even the women did, and that they were irresponsible sexually, they were harming their children, and all of these other kinds of things. And so you have these kinds of disparities in which people who are similarly situated in both sort of class terms but different racially are seen. So we can see how, you know, being poor does kind of expose you to a set of problems, including things like drug addiction, et cetera, including the, I guess, what's the vice president's daughter's mother-in-law, right? Likely mother-in-law. She got arrested on meth, right? What's his name? Levi, whatever his name is. His mom, up in Alaska. So what happens is people very similarly situated are treated very differently by these systems. Even though we can think about the relationship between the likelihood of the sort of poverty and the kinds of cycle and destructiveness of drug addiction and sort of in individual lives and its potential exposure. So if you're rich and white and you're addicted to drugs, you know, you often might be using prescription drugs. You have, you know, private drug dealers in the valley that you can get. You know, you can go by their house and get the whatever you need, whether it be cocaine or heroin or et cetera. And you can operate outside of the possibilities of being accosted by the police. You know, if you're poor and black and you're either buying or selling drugs, you're much more likely to do it in streets. You're much more likely to do it in places that are much more heavily surveillanced by police. And you're much more likely to end up in jail. You know, drug addiction is equally spread across all economic classes and races in the context of the country. Everybody likes dope. Well, not everybody likes dope. I shouldn't say stuff like that. But, you know, all groups are equally prone to its use. And so, but what we see is there's a sort of disproportionate amount of surveillance. And so that's just to say that if we think about some of the issues that Black Marxists think about, and we use a kind of class, both the sort of class and race analysis, we can take the sort of issue of the war on drugs and things like that and kind of understand both the sort of class component of it, about how selling drugs, et cetera, is likely, much more likely to be driven into or be done at a sort of dangerous level by people who are poor and people of color, that then leads to imprisonment. We have a whole sort of prison system and industry that then operates to transfer wealth from some communities to other communities, and in particular to sort of benefit poor white communities by imprisoning poor Black and brown people. And even their willingness to engage in that practice, right? To sort of say it's the fact of their underemployment or unemployment or lack of opportunities that leads them to say, well, let's lock all the people up that we can so we'll have a job. And so you can think about the ways in which, in this sense, right, then the classes, working class people of color, working class white people in rural areas versus working class people in urban areas are played off one another. It's perceived that their interests are in contrast to one another by the use of this kind of prison system. And it prevents the development of working class coalitions around to fight the larger problem of unemployment, underemployment, or a lack of a kind of social welfare state, or so you want a job in the prison because it provides health coverage, health care, a bunch of things that you need for your family that you otherwise wouldn't be able to access. And so that's the sort of close up on the Black Marxist piece, and kind of transition to I'm going to do a bit on sort of dissolution, liberalism at the end here. So let's see if I can get this going. So given all that, and given the kind of frustration that you heard expressed by Carmichael and others, there's a kind of version of liberalism where that radical egalitarians who are frequently hopeful for American redemption historically have often found themselves sort of beating their head against the wall, right? This is Stokely Carmichael's moment comes at the Selma March, where he essentially has, after seeing the people being beaten, Carmichael has a nervous breakdown and rejects the idea of nonviolent social change, the concept of integration, and begins to decide to believe in Black power. It's the violence against the peaceful marchers that begins to turn Carmichael to believe that perhaps whites are incapable of extending a hand of justice to Blacks. And in that sense, right, the kind of idea of universal liberal rights being extended to people of African descent or African Americans becomes essentially questioned and challenged in the context and in the face of the kind of violent urban riots. Or you heard Stokely Carmichael saying, well, we passed the Civil Rights Act in 1965. This is the Civil Rights 64, Voting Rights Act 65. And what's happened, right? We still live in the same ghettos. Black people are still poor. We're still suffering from police brutality. These things, nothing's changed. And so these kinds of things, or civil rights or universal liberal rights, are mere sort of window dressing that do not provide the basic kinds of benefits that people need in order to move on. Now, some people are unwilling to make the transition all the way to either nationalism or Marxism, right? It's just sort of entirely rejected. So they remain kind of in a space of being sort of disillusioned, at least for some period of time, about the capacity of the system itself. So if we think about the sort of major tenets of disillusioned liberalism, and I want to sort of characterize that this is a very unstable trend. So and it has a lot of the kind of sort of raises a lot of the questions that become raised in both sort of nationalism and Black Marxism. So one, that the problem is the unwillingness of the part of whites to accept Black equality, right? So you start to begin to question the goodwill of white citizens and their willingness to accept. They believe that the prospects of citizenship are dim because whites are too attached to the system, to the current economic, social, political system, and the system of racism. They're therefore too invested or too indifferent to change. There's also frequently a questioning of capitalism. And so some of the solutions are self-segregation, right? We need to build our own. We need to continue to build our own institutions. We don't really know what we want to do. We might focus on Black economic and political power or socialism, and many people then actually finding themselves into the space adopt a different ideological position. So I'm questioning capitalism. So if I'm questioning capitalism, where do I end up going? Marxism, right? I end up being a Black Marxist. If I question the capacity of whites to let go of racism, and I think that we just need to go at our own, where do I end up? Black nationalism, right? And various versions of it. And so it's a kind of unstable space or a transitionary phase where many Black political actors who had once been sort of optimistic about the possibilities of American change or American redemption, many radical egalitarians become disillusioned with the sort of ideas and connection and parts connected with liberalism. So I'm gonna go through. I'm gonna talk about sort of two major figures who I think at one point in time in their careers existed as disillusioned liberals. So W.E.B. Du Bois, we talked about him as a radical egalitarian, his construction of double consciousness. And I would sort of say the many times the sort of transition, and this is one of the interesting parts about, in particular, Black political thought is that these thinkers are always responding to the events around them, the events in their historical moment. So Du Bois is extraordinarily committed to the idea that American democracy may someday correct itself. It may lift the veil, right, and include the understanding. And in the run-up to World War I, he calls upon African Americans to close ranks, set aside our special grievances, and take up the fight with the U.S. That is, he says that Blacks should support the war effort, become patriotic Americans, with the idea that hopefully in that moment of service and sacrifice, that they will emerge and be recognized for their humanity and as full citizens. There's a number of things that happened during World War I. One thing that's exposed is that a number of Black troops go over to World War I. They serve in France. They serve valiantly. And one thing that happens is that while they're over there, it's exposed that the U.S. Pentagon has sent a special directive to the French, which tells them, look, don't treat these Black troops as equals. Don't allow them, don't let them into your establishments. Don't treat them as liberators. And it goes on to say, to make a series of sort of racist arguments, arguing that they're less than human. This is directly, not exactly from the Pentagon, but it's from the War Department. This is a direct kind of directive to the French, and it gets exposed. And so think about it this way: you are a black soldier wearing your country's uniform, fighting in a foreign land for the sort of interest of your country, and you find there's a directive being sent that's telling them that basically you're less than human, undeserving of a basic set of rights. This set off a huge thing. And it was not lost on Du Bois that even service in the U.S. military, even putting on the uniform, wasn't going to confer respect and or citizenship, even or recognition on the part of the U.S. government. The other thing that I believe that began to cause Du Bois to become disillusioned was the summer of 1919. This is the summer when the war ends and troops are returning. The summer of 1919 was frequently called the Red Summer because it was one of the summers that had the most race riots all over the country. New York, Chicago, there were riots in Oklahoma and a range of other places. Black soldiers returning from World War I were lynched in uniform in places in the South. Texas, other places where they were, being put back in their place, so to speak. Right? You're wearing this uniform. You perceive yourself to be proud, a real American. We will show you where you really belong. You can also think about the soldier sense of themselves and their own sense of efficacy. Right? I've gone out on the battlefield. I've even shot white people. Right? They bleed like everybody else. These were Germans, but the point is that I can defend myself. I don't have to accept a certain kind of treatment. This caused a series of conflicts and urban riots. This time, in many of the urban riots, in particular in Chicago and other places, in Chicago, the riot was caused first by there were the sort of beach around Lake Michigan was segregated and separated into two sides. A black youth swam over to around the white side and was stoned and drowned. This set off a riot where the blacks actually initially attacked the whites, and then the whites, along with the police and everyone, attacked back against blacks, but also against dark-skinned Mexicans. Living in the context of the city of Chicago in 1919. And so these kinds of riots were different than some of the other, than the sort of previous history of racial violence or lynching, in that in this case, right, following World War I, blacks started to fight back. This time, and Du Bois suggested that the World War II is not the fight of African Americans any longer. That it's a capitalist war that is not the cause that African Americans should be fighting for. So he's dramatically in that case. His engagement with the Communist Party is actually purged out of the organization that he helped to found, the NAACP. The McCarthy era. I talked about that a little bit earlier. So Du Bois has made the transition all the way to communism. He then, after being purged out of the NAACP, attacked by the sort of McCarthy era, Du Bois decides, the sort of ultimate radical egalitarian, the inventor of modern sociology, Harvard graduate, decides he's going to move to Ghana, where he lives the rest of his life in Africa, outside of the U.S. So one of the leading intellectuals within the context of American life and American history ends up living the last years of his life, not in the context of the United States, but actually in Ghana in Africa. It's Martin Luther King Jr. We can talk about Martin Luther King Jr. at the sort of end of his life. We saw that we listened to the final speech. But one of the things that Martin Luther King began to do at the end of his life was he began to question a series of things. So one of the things that was sort of interesting was he began to sort of recast what his set of interests were. So one thing he began to say was that, first of all, we never talked about a civil rights movement. A civil rights movement is a name that you guys put on this sort of after the fact, right? We always called it, and the people involved in what we now understand to be the civil rights movement called it the freedom struggle. There's a big difference between the civil rights movement and the freedom struggle, right? Civil rights was, as King was apt to point out, was achieved with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, right? That struggle's over. There was no longer any movement for civil rights. The freedom struggle was a broader struggle about the sort of question of inequality and human dignity and human rights, which couldn't necessarily be contained or ended with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So his argument was the civil rights is a done issue, right? That was passed that's why we have a Civil Rights Act. That does not mean that the freedom struggle is over. King, at the time of his death, began two things that I think are extraordinarily, two things that are extraordinarily important. One, the events that led him to Memphis was a labor strike. He talks about it, in particular of sanitation workers, overwhelmingly black sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. And it's part of what King has labeled his Poor People's Campaign. So King begins to reframe the struggle, the freedom struggle, as not simply being about achieving civil rights, which was largely a kind of social right, but towards addressing the sort of broader question of poverty and inequality in the economy. And in doing that, King begins to question the capacity, while he rejects explicitly communism, he does begin to actually question the capacity of capitalism to deal with the sort of questions and issues of inequality, and begins to suggest that perhaps we need something like a minimal income. We need a broader social welfare state or safety net in order to ensure human dignity and that people can achieve their human potential. And so the Poor People's Campaign begins to address these sort of broader issues of inequality. The other thing is towards the end of his life, King does something that then distances himself from the kind of both the sort of the anti-communist perspective that had been sort of the ethos of the war. He comes out against the war in Vietnam, stating that, and in fact he gives a series of extraordinary speeches where King is actually quite puzzled about why people are so upset. I mean, he's roundly attacked for coming against the war of Vietnam. Actually, interestingly enough, UCLA graduate Jackie Robinson, who had himself served in World War II before going to play professional baseball, writes King a scathing letter about his opposition to the war in Vietnam, saying that he's betraying American patriotism. How could you do this? And then King turns around and gives quite a series of amazing speeches as he's sort of facing criticism for his opposition to the war in Vietnam, and says, when I advocated nonviolence against, in opposition to injustice in the South and in urban areas in America and all this stuff, I've been praised. When I advocate nonviolence in relationship to brown people in Vietnam, I'm attacked, right? The nonviolent, to him, he sees the nonviolent principle as being, if it's moral in the context of the U.S. and applies to the struggle for civil rights, and should be, and he should be praised for that, then why shouldn't he be praised for advocating nonviolence in the context of dealing with the issues and questions in Vietnam? He saw the war as a colonial war, as driven by sort of capitalist interests, and began to question the capacity of and the sort of moral certitude of the U.S. government and the U.S. public in their willingness to engage in what he saw as clearly an immoral conflict in the context of Vietnam. This also begins to create a tension. King is, on one hand, he's being sort of battered by folks like Stokely Carmichael, as you saw in some of your readings, and the young folks are advocating for black power. But on the other hand, the much more sort of conservative leadership and the leadership that's sort of urging King to sort of be king and not to continue to agitate now that the Civil Rights Bill is passed, are saying, look, we've given you your Civil Rights Bill. We've done what we could for you. What do you want now? And he's saying, look, I really am concerned about this question of poverty that touches all races. I really am concerned. When I said I meant nonviolence, I really do mean nonviolence. I truly am a pacifist in those terms, and this is what I believe in. And I don't just mean nonviolence in the context of the southern United States. I mean that nonviolence equally applies to the Viet Cong and the people in Vietnam. So King extends his points, and in some ways becomes a much more sort of isolated figure because he doesn't easily fit into the kind of orthodoxy that had existed before. He isn't entirely allied with the sort of young groups of kind of anti-war protesters and black power advocates and young radicals. Yet he's saying things that are coincident with some of their sets of beliefs, but from his own kind of perspective. Not from a black power perspective, but from his perspective of the actions and belief of sort of nonviolent social change. But King himself also begins to sort of question, as he sees the war in Vietnam, as he tries to even move some of the questions, and he sees the fact that, look, you don't have formal segregation in the North, yet you have huge in the North, the West, California, Chicago. You have huge and expansive black ghettos that don't seem to be improving. He sees that eliminating segregation isn't enough, right? The white racism, as well as a sort of capitalist system, may be larger and much more intractable than King imagined at the end of his life. And then he also at the same time begins to question the moral capacity of Americans given their willingness to engage in what he sees as immoral war against in Vietnam. So at the end of his life, King is in a very unstable space with regard to where he is. He's moving away from a kind of simple belief that the basic sort of liberal values can easily or roughly solve the central problems that face African Americans in the context of the U.S. or solve the larger problems in the wider world. So King never quite. Many have sort of argued that given the sort of shift to a much sort of broader perspective that Malcolm X envisaged at the end of his life, which ends sort of before King begins this kind of transition, but as well as the kind of perspective that King begins to develop, where he begins to sort of question some of the things and begins to sort of move with some of the ideas. People suggest that perhaps had they both survived longer, King and Malcolm X might have squared the circle in some sense, and come to a much more place of sort of a deeper understanding. One thing we can also understand as King begins to question capitalism, begins to think about sort of anti-colonial struggles on the global stage and question U.S. policy in terms of its imperialist adventures in places like Vietnam. King actually becomes much more like the activists in the 20s and 30s than the activists of the 40s and 50s, which had adopted the Cold War framework, which is let's purge the communists, the civil rights struggle is a domestic struggle. It's a domestic struggle only. It doesn't have these kinds of international implications. And so King begins to transition, not in some ways as a kind of, in a way that's a sort of aberration, but he begins to kind of reclaim the legacy that Du Bois had left when he departed for West Africa. So I will stop there. On Tuesday, we're going to pick back up, and we're going to make a big transition to Black conservatism. So thank you. I'll see you guys next week.